That's pretty cool. So today we have a special guest with us that I wanted to actually incorporate as part of our Everybody Always, but in a broader way. I'll mention this more next week. Next week, by the way, is going to be kind of a little bit of a preview about what's to come in the next ministry season. I can definitely see through Christmas. Pretty impressive, isn't it? So I'll talk about some things we're doing from now until then. Pretty cool stuff for you, really. Some heavy-duty thinking stuff that we're going to do, but then also we're going to introduce some classes that will really help you connect the dots with this. How do you do this spiritual life thing, and how do you become the person that God has created you to be in powerful ways? So that stuff's coming. I'll talk more about that. And then periodically, I want to bring in leaders from the community. They're doing interesting things that can tell us about some of these interesting things they're doing in the community. Part of that is because we need to celebrate that and acknowledge that, but I think it's really helpful for us to be informed about the broader community and not to be siloed as a church just about our own stuff. In the Bible, really throughout the Bible, mental illness is an issue. And they didn't know to call it that, but it was definitely there. And so it's not a stranger to us, and there's still, to this day, an unfair level of baggage attached to anything to do with mental illness. So if you've got a back issue, if you've got a bulging disc, well, you can talk all day about that, but if you've got anxiety, hush, hush. It shouldn't be that way. Or if you've got arthritis, we can all talk about that openly, but don't talk about depression because people will look funny at you, or bipolar or whatever, or God forbid you're having suicidal tendencies. Keep that quiet because of the stigma that surrounds all things mental health. The reality is that there were people in the Old Testament and the New Testament that struggled with mental illness. They called the different things back then. There's one case where King Saul, Israel's first king, we're not exactly sure what he had going on exactly, but he would go into these phases where he was unconsoled and would tear somebody apart if they were there. The only thing that would calm him down was soon-to-be King David would come in, and I guess he was pretty awesome with a six string because he'd play his six string, and that would calm Saul down. But sometimes he'd have to avoid spears being aimed at his head to do that. So Saul struggled with this stuff. Later on, there's a foreign king who had some kind of a nervous breakdown and kind of lived kind of as an animal for many years before he kind of came back to, and something happened to help that along. In the New Testament with Jesus, you see this. Sometimes what they would look at and associate with demon possession, we're looking at it now and saying, well, maybe, but it sure looks like mental illness too. And so even people that are steeped in that whole world of demon possession and the spiritual warfare stuff, they acknowledge that that kind of stuff, from their theological vantage point, that those are closely associated with each other sometimes. And so if you're not into that side of thing, that's fine, but you got to still see that some of the things that Jesus was dealing with in his day were clearly people that struggled with mental illness. And so he was not afraid to embrace them and include them as part of the Everybody Always that he came to bring hope to. Well, good new friend of mine, Jeni Olsen. I'm going to let her tell her own story, but she's doing an amazing thing with Teens Connect. She also happens to be a newly minted member of CrossWalk, so we're very happy to have her join us on stage. So come on up, Jeni. Give you the official greeting hug. All right. So, first of all, I don't know how many people have gotten to know you well, so why don't you take a moment, just tell us all of your worst secrets, and tell us as much about yourself as you'd like to before we get any further.
Okay, so this on?
Oh, let me see. First fail of the day. All right. Yeah, we're good.
I'm human. Oh my God. Okay, so I hope you guys have your sleeping bags because we're going to be here overnight. I have a lot to share about myself. Thank you so much for having me up here, Pete, and all of you guys. Thank you for being here and for listening to me share my story. I moved to Napa in '95 After I graduated from Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, I got my degree in graphic and packaging design. I moved up here. I had a really good job in Berkeley. I worked for a couple years commuting to Berkeley. And then I got pregnant with my first son and knew that I didn't want to commute, so I started my own design business so I could work from home and be a full-time mom and just do it all, like often we're told we can do, especially women. And I tried. I gave it my best shot. I had a couple of babies. I ran my own design firm for 20 years in Napa. And I loved being a designer. I loved my clients. I loved everything about my life, really, as far as my career, my kids, that sort of thing. But in 2017, I'm going to flash forward and then I'm going to go back again. In 2017, just 2 years ago, I gave up my design career and I started a nonprofit called Teens Connect. And I'll share a little bit more about Teens Connect and our mission in a little bit. But I want to kind of go back to 2010, kind of somewhere in the middle of when I moved to Napa and when I started Teens Connect. 2010, I got sober. I came to terms with the fact that I was an alcoholic, and alcohol was controlling my life, and I didn't want that to be the case anymore. So I got sober, and the funny thing is, I've just been coming to CrossWalk for not even, just a couple of months. But I've been coming here for 9 years to go to AA meetings and many other things. Yeah. So when I got sober, I was really struggling. Obviously, it was really, really hard. Something that I really struggled with at first was finding my spiritual program, finding my higher self. I grew up Catholic. When I was a teenager, I had a really hard time as a teenager. I really struggled as a teenager. And I sort of left the Catholic Church, my whole family did, and I didn't know, hadn't had a spiritual practice since then. So finding a higher power, redefining my higher power, was a sort of a couple-year process. During the time newly in my sobriety, I was really, really struggling also with my depression, which I had been diagnosed as a teenager with, and still struggle with to this day. I will have a lifelong struggle with depression. It's something I manage on a regular basis. And there was a moment early in my sobriety where I felt like I wanted to die. And it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to die, I just wanted the pain to stop, and I didn't know how to make it stop. And through that experience of being sober, I reconnected with myself when I was a teenager, and when I was 15, my parents put me in a drug rehabilitation center, and I ended up in a mental hospital because I was suicidal. I attempted suicide when I was 15. And so getting sober, I had to basically go back and heal that teenager that still hadn't been healed. I had been using alcohol all those years to sort of self-medicate my depression, my teen years, my teen pain. I got through it with the help of an amazing community, with the help of my higher power, who I was still defining at the time. Now I know, as Pete was just describing, God was holding me during that time. But I also had a calling during that time. My kids were actually teenagers, young teenagers, at the time I got sober. And I had a calling. I knew that I somehow had to work with teenagers. Because as I was healing my teen, I knew that there was a lot of teens out there that needed help, that needed support, that needed guidance, that needed something. Because it's a really hard time of life, the teenage years. So I had a calling to work with teens, and I didn't really know what that looked like yet. But I just kind of held it in my mind. And it slowly started unfolding because I actually started praying about it and asking my higher power, how will this manifest? How can I work with teens? How can I help teens? Because of my experience as a teenager. And so I actually started working with my younger son in his middle school. We started a club together called Be the Change. He and his friends started coming once a week. We'd meet at school at lunchtime, and we'd start working on volunteer projects. We'd collect items for local organizations that needed help, like diapers. We helped with Operation with Love from Home. I have brought a few friends with me today. Liz Alessio, she is the executive director of Operation with Love from Home. We helped hers way back then. While I'm at it, I'll introduce my friend Harris Nussbaum is also here. He was one of my early inspirations in starting my work with teens. So basically, in working with teens and introducing them to volunteer projects, locally and then also globally, we started traveling on service trips. I saw how much meaning that work brought to the lives of our young teens, how much self-esteem it gave them, how much connection it gave them to other people, how it took them out of their self-absorbed lives and gave them a different focus. And it really inspired me because they would make these projects their own, and they would bring their own talents and gifts and heart into the projects. And so we basically grew over the next couple of years into this community-wide organization that worked out of the Boys and Girls Club for a while. We helped them stimulate a mentor project where our older teens were reading to our younger kids, and it just really blossomed, and more teens were attracted to this work. Let me know if you want to interrupt and ask
You're
anything.
doing great.
Just keep going.
I wish you were comfortable on stage.
Okay, I know. You can tell. This is my very first time being in front of people. So we actually, my kids who were at the middle school, where my son was, River Middle School, they graduated and went on to, all the high schools in the area. So at this point, we had kids from all these different high schools as part of our club. So then everything was going great. I was working full-time as a designer, working with teens on the side. That was sort of my calling, my spiritual practice, my passion. And then in 2016, we lost 2 teenagers in Napa to suicide. Joey Douglas was a 10th grader at Vintage High School, and Edwin Diaz Garcia was an 8th grader at Redwood Middle School. And our whole community, of course, was shocked. Some of you may remember when this happened. We got together, we started talking about what was going on with our teens, why they felt the need to take their own lives, what we could do to help. And I thought, is anybody asking our teenagers what's going on? So my friend, actually, Linda Inlay, the principal of River Middle School, where my son and these kids went, we got together and we decided, let's ask the teens. Let's get our teens together and ask them what's going on. So we got together with my son and his group of friends that were part of my club, and we asked them, are you struggling with stress, anxiety, depression, other things that are bothering you? If so, what are those things? They all raised their hand. These are kids I knew very, very well. I knew they came from good families. I knew they had support. My son even said that he had been struggling with depression, and I didn't know until I asked the question. All of them said their stress, they rated their stress levels. They were in 10th grade, around 10th grade at the time, at a 7 or higher on the scale of 1 to 10. And some of them talked about having suicidal thoughts. We asked them, are you talking about this to anybody? And they all said no. They didn't want to worry their parents. They didn't think their teachers had time, or that was their job to listen to their mental health concerns. They didn't want to feel judged. They felt bad for having these feelings because they knew they had everything they needed and wanted, so why would they be feeling sad, and lonely and scared? So this sort of prompted our work. We got together. Harris was one of our first team members on a grassroots group called Village Napa, and we decided to go to the different school sites in Napa and have these same conversations with a variety of kids, all representing all the kids in our community, all the teenagers in our community. We had one of our wellness cafes at a middle school and one at a high school. We opened up the conversation. All the kids that came opened up, spoke, shared about what was going on, shared about their struggles, shared about the pressures that were going on in their lives, talked about what they needed from the adults in their lives. And basically, in short, this is what prompted me to start Teens Connect, because I knew that this work had to be done full time. I knew that for every teen we were hearing from, there were hundreds more that weren't sharing, that weren't talking, that didn't have places to go and to connect. So within a year, I'd given up my design firm. I started Teens Connect. And here we are today, rocking and rolling with a nonprofit that's serving thousands of teens in Napa.
Awesome. Really awesome. Yeah. You did all that in one breath. That's amazing.
I know. So let me take a breath, and then I'll go to another question.
Mm-hmm. So, I no longer have teenagers. My kids are 20 and 22, but I'm pretty close to that whole age and the drama they went through. But I'm guessing maybe some folks are more removed from it. And I can just remember in my in my former church many years ago, this woman, and kind of hearing what you're saying, her comment would be, what do these teenagers have to be complaining about? What are they so upset about? When I grew up, I had to walk up to school uphill both ways through the driven snow, and all this kind of stuff. So from your experience, obviously respecting an anonymity where it's important and all that, give us a clue what teenagers seem to be dealing with today that may be different than in years past.
So I think that the pressures, number one, the pressures that are on our teens today to succeed academics, to get into the best college, to do everything they're doing well, is, I think, the main overriding idea. There are many reasons that they're feeling these things. It's not necessarily messages they're getting from their parents or their teachers or their community. It's all of the above, plus social media. They're seeing constantly what other people are doing better than them. They're seeing that people look better than them. They're performing better in school or sports or extracurriculars. You know, and there's this pressure that all of our teens, this message that they all need to go to four-year colleges directly from high school. And that's not necessarily the case. And I think that what's happened is our teens have become perfectionists, extreme perfectionists. They put all of this on, and they want to do everything well and perfect and the best, which means nothing they do is the best, because perfectionism really isn't a thing, right? There's no such thing as perfect, being perfect. And not to mention, it's really competitive getting into college. You know, I know that some of the UCs, that when my son was applying a year ago, the acceptance rate was like 5 or 6%, some of our UCs. My older son went to community college and started working right from there. My younger son is at a four-year college down south. So there are two routes right there. Amazing community colleges in town, great programs, travel, so many other things. So I think that's the main overriding pressure. I also think that our world is a really scary place today, and our teens see and hear and feel and taste everything that's going on constantly. And they don't know how, we don't barely know how to manage it all. I know that it weighs on me on a daily basis when I listen to the news too much, or you hear about another shooting. We've had earthquakes and fires and shootings in our own community. A lot of my teens knew an Lincoln Housley who was killed last year. So they see these things and they feel these things, and they don't know what to do with all that, on top of trying to perform on a daily basis with their schedules that are too full. And then feeling like we don't have anyone to talk to about what's going on. Some of our teens have diagnosable mental illness, and Pete shared about how there's still a big stigma surrounding mental illness. And then there's just your good old sadness and anxiety that even if you don't have a mental illness diagnosable, you still feel all those things sometimes, and you need to be able to process them somehow. And our teens don't necessarily have those outlets or know what those outlets are. Another thing is there's a lot of trauma that I've seen as I've been working with teens more and more that is popping up as they find places and people they can trust. I have teens that have shared deep secrets with me about things that happened when they were children, and it wasn't until they were connected with a therapist or somebody at school or myself that they could open up about these things and then start getting treated for things that, you know, are horrible, traumatic experiences. So there's a lot of layers. There's a lot of layers. I just think that, you know, I know that I don't claim to have all the answers because I'm not a teenager. That's why I continue to ask my teens and to let them sort of inform our programs, because they're the only ones that really know the pressures that they're feeling today. They're in it, you know. And we have a teen council on Teens Connect, which is comprised of, you know, more than a dozen teens from all our high schools, super diverse. They represent our teen community in Napa, and they're the boots on the ground. They've been trained in youth mental health first aid. They have me and other mentors in the community. Pete's worked with them to help guide them so that they can influence and inspire their peers to get more involved, to turn their grief into action, to open up and share about their mental health, to help each other and support each other, to speak up when they feel something's not right. You know, that's a big thing today with the violence that's happening. I heard a term last year after a violent act. One of my teens said, we talked about like why nobody says anything when there's bullying, when bullying goes on. And one of my teens said, well, because snitches get stitches and end up in ditches. So they don't say things because they're scared they're going to be the next victim. So we have to give them safe places where they can share what's going on. They can share things they see in the community because they see it. Our teens are the first responders to their peers. So they need to be trained on how to respond to things that are happening in the community.
Yeah, it's really good. I love that you touched on, you know, family history stuff, because, you know, young teens and all the way through teenage years, really into early adulthood, kids don't have the toolkit to know what to do with emotional trauma that happens to them. And some of these kids had things happen when they were in infancy. And we tell ourselves, oh, they were an infant, they didn't know what was going on. Well, the research says, oh, yeah, they do. It impacts your brain. And so some of those things start to show up, in teenage years, and how would they have the maturity or capacity to deal with it? And I was with, I did a workshop for Jeni's leaders this past week, and it was on the Enneagram. And one of the pieces of the Enneagram, the idea of the Enneagram is that, we have our true self that, we're constantly wooed to live into and become, the purest, best self that we can be. But we have a wound happen to us, which is normal and natural in every human family. And that wound then creates a longing in us to experience the love that we're looking for and all that. And so I read through a list of 9 different scenarios about the way that different types of people experience that wound and what it does to them. And while I was trucking through it, I was like, oh man, this is way too much for this teenage audience. They're not with me and all that. And I got through with the list, and I said, so is that hitting anybody? And they're all like, yeah. So even something like that, where they begin to recognize that there's something going on under the hood that they couldn't even articulate and maybe even can't yet. And we also know, this is pretty new brain science, but we know that some things are even passed on genetically from one generation to the other. Not the obvious things that we know about, but tendencies, ways to think about the world, fears, anxieties. It's really crazy what we're learning about our brains and how they're developed. So some of these kids, they may have had a perfectly good childhood and a perfectly loving home, but their grandparents went through trauma that set them in a way. And what we're learning is sometimes things can even skip a generation and show up. It's fascinating and frightening all at the same time. And one of the things I shared with the kids, I do have a question coming, so take another drink. But one of the things I share with the kids is, I grew up in about as healthy as a household as you possibly can. I have, in terms of clinical adverse childhood experiences, I don't have any. My parents loved each other, stayed together. There was never violence in the home. It was supportive the whole way through. Kind words grace was the tone of the home. You know what I mean? Went to church nearly every Sunday. My dad was a pastor. My grandpas were pastors. It was just an ideal kind of a growing up. And yet, I still deal with my childhood wound. So it's not about, I didn't have serious enough trauma to worry about this stuff or to feel depressed. My struggle with some emotional and mental health issues is still rooted in that. So it's something we manage, we work out the rest of our lives, which gets me to a question. So give us a broad stroke view of things that you found particularly helpful for these youth. And I do want to ask another thing too on the way to that. What seems to be helping and one other thing I wanted to bring out, because I heard you say this at city council, that LGBTQ kids in particular, they're at higher risk of this stuff. Can you unpack why that is? Tell us all the solutions.
Okay. So, yes, our LGBTQ community, when I was doing research for us to go present to the city council about our request to raise the rainbow flag in order to be seen and seen as an inclusive community, I shared that in Napa Valley Unified School District, so that's Napa and American Canyon schools, 44% of our LGBTQ high schoolers had considered suicide in the past year. That's almost half. 16% of all of our kids, general population, have considered suicide. That's not okay, but 44% is absurd. And I know for a fact from some of our kids on our council are LGBTQ. Like I said, we have a very diverse council, and we've talked about this. Teenagers need to feel like they belong to something bigger than themselves. And that's really what prompted me to bring in Pete to do this workshop on the personality traits and how you could use your gifts to strengthen your leadership in sort of a spiritual way. We're not a religious organization. I didn't want it to be religious. We have a couple of Jewish kids, a Muslim girl, a wide variety of religions on our teen council. I just wanted to help our kids learn to give them tools to learn about their gifts and their strengths. Because as I'm mentoring them and I'm bringing in other mentors from the community to mentor them, they're mentoring their friends and their peers and giving them places and opportunities to be connected and to belong. So part of our goal this year is to expand our network of teams that we're reaching and to design committees. We're still working on this, but we've got a committee that's going to be based around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a committee that's going to be based around volunteering in the community, and we have a committee based on mentoring younger teens. So these three committees, any teen in Napa can be involved, because we want to make sure that anybody, there's places for teens to go and be involved if you're into sports, if you're into academics, if you're into dance. But there's a lot of teens that aren't into those things and don't have places to go. And so I've heard over the years from a couple of teens and a couple of parents who've said to me, thank you for giving my child somewhere to go to do some kind of work. And this is around volunteering. And like I said, volunteering sort of crosses all those platforms. Any teen can be involved in volunteering and improve their lives and improve their self-esteem. So really, I think continuing to design places for teens to go to be involved, to connect them to older mentors, that's really valuable. We're expanding our programs in the middle schools this year, so that every seventh grader will get local 6-week course called Resilience for Youth, so they can learn tools for resilience to strengthen their grit. Talks about what to do when things are hard, and how do you find those tools to keep going. So we're really trying to give teens these tools. Connect them to each other, and connect them to older mentors.
Very good. So far I'm hearing, one, the game has changed for teenagers. It's harder now than it has been in previous generations, which may be counterintuitive because we think of all the resources that we have available that are helpful for teenagers, but there's that flip side of that too, that also cranks up the volume exponentially to add more pressure to them. So we're kind of learning about that. You're telling us some strategies that help. And just to piggyback on the last thing you said about mentorship, a lot of research has been done on youth ministry and what's effective in churches, what keeps kids in churches. You know what they're discovering? It's not the big high gloss youth group that is sticky, but it's connection with the rest of the church community that makes the connection with the body of Christ, with church in general and faith in general. You matter. You matter. Our church hasn't had a massive youth program, but you know what? My kids, Noah and Lakin, they love God and they love church. You know why? Because you love them, which is amazing since they're the pastor's kids. Really. So don't minimize the great power that you have when teenagers come into your zone or at your table and are acting shy and disinterested and on their phone. Don't take offense to it. See it as an opportunity to be graceful and to bring love and to get to know them, because you really don't know how important that is. So that's really
Yeah, and so that reminds me of something I recently wrote about called community care. Even if one of my sons has anxiety disorder. He struggled with anxiety his whole life. He had a hard time getting through school. My other son, Mr. Popular, has a ton of friends, went through a short bout of depression after he got an injury from football, but he just has basically lived a charmed life. And so they're raised the same, right? They have completely different experiences. If I would have had only my son that had mental illness, I would have thought that it was my fault that he struggled the way he did. If I only had the son that didn't have any problems, basically, I would have thought I was an amazing parent, right? But what I do know in working with all of these other teens that all have different stories and different, parents with different parenting styles, is that we need to be those mentors for everybody's kids, starting when they're little. That's what's called community care. And especially, you can think about the fact that I have a friend who has 3 kids and they're all perfect, right? But she knows that her children's community are her children's community, and so she needs to help them be well so that they are supports for her kids, if that makes sense. We have to be in this. We need to be in this together. We need to care for each other's children, because there's no such thing as other people's children. They're all our children. They're children of God, and they're children that are connected to us. We're all connected.
Really good. And so that sort of leads us into, are there other ways, other than what you just said, that we can be supportive, praying for you, hoping for you with Teens Connect and teens in general? What can we do if we want to get more help?
Well, I will be launching this year this mentorship, kind of a mentorship program. I have big ideas about a giant mentorship program, but I have like 49 ideas. I don't have time to run yet. But I think just staying connected. I'm here almost every Sunday. We have a great website. I send out a newsletter. You can sign up for that on our website. As we start forming these committees, I'm going to be looking for mentors to kind of help our teens in these different committees we talked about. Also, volunteering. Our teens love volunteering. They volunteer here at the church sometimes. They volunteer at the table downtown. They volunteer anywhere they can around town. So just praying for us would be great. We'd really appreciate that. Praying for our teams, all the teams. This is not just something that's local. This struggle with mental health, mental illness, perfectionism, it's a national thing, and it's actually a global phenomenon right now. It's really hard to be a teen, and so just really spending that time in your prayers, sending love out to all the teens and young people in the world. One of the things, as I said, as I mentioned, we do is we go on global service trips. We've gone on 8 to mostly Central America, Haiti, Honduras, Guatemala, and the connections I see my teens make with kids in other countries is unbelievable, and it makes them better local citizens. And so just that, thinking globally, acting locally, it's so powerful. And we can apply that to prayer as well, right? Praying locally, praying globally. Come up with some new slogan. But, just staying connected. Come up and talk to me if you want more information about how you might get involved. And Pete has been so gracious. Pete and Dar have been so gracious to let us use the youth room here for all of our meetings. The teens absolutely love it. They've kind of made it their own. Hopefully none of them are sneaking in and sleeping here at night. I don't think that's happened yet, but I haven't duplicated the key. So we're really grateful to have a home for our teens here at CrossWalk.
That's awesome. Said something I wanted to back up to. I'm sure it's very important, profound.
One more thing, I forgot to mention, a very important part of Teens Connect is early on when I started having these conversations at the schools and realizing that teens, number one, just needed to share and talk and hear that they're not alone when they, listen to other teens share about their struggles. I also knew that some of these teens were going to need professional help, so I approached Mentis, a local organization, and asked if they would partner with me to provide free therapy on our schools. And they said yes, and we now have our programs on 10 middle and high schools in Napa, American Canyon, and St. Helena. So our teens who need it can get free professional help at their schools. It's accessible, it's free, and they're utilizing it. So I really am grateful for all the connections and all the partners I have in Napa. I couldn't do this alone. And I also know for a fact that it's not just me doing this work, it's my higher power working through me. And my job is to continue asking how I can be of service and how I can be of help and staying sober and staying clear and connected. And then that this work just keeps happening. So.
Yeah, this is such a clear, to me, it's just such a clear, obvious thing that God is in and doing. Even though it doesn't have a church stamp on it, I don't think God gives a rip a lot of the time about, the church logo or who's doing it. Clearly, God's Spirit is with you and doing things, because anytime we see that kind of restorative, redemptive work, well, there's the presence of God. Anytime we see that kind of love and grace happening. And I got to tell you, I've seen, a couple things. This is what I meant to say. First, I just think the design is brilliant. The idea of mutual support, learning, sharing together, and then the service aspect. That, I think, is so smart, because it gets your head out of yourself and you're doing something for somebody else. And a lot of times you're in environments and cultural contexts that are real eye-openers for kids, and that it just gives them great perspective. And so, way to go on that. And then, I just saw her in action. I've seen her in action a couple times with her group. But what Jeni does with her leadership, she strikes the perfect balance of professionalism, but caring with the kids, so they know that they're valued and loved, and yet they still know she's the executive director of this thing. But it's a very flat model, if you understand what that means, where the kids feel free to be them, that's some creative work on your part. But it's just an amazing group of kids that you've assembled for great things. So way to go on that. Cool. And out of curiosity, why'd you land at CrossWalk?
So as I said, when I got sober in 2010, I had to redefine my relationship with my higher power, and I did. And I never actually thought I would land in a church again. I didn't have a good taste in my mouth from my upbringing as a Catholic. I dabbled in a few other things. I'd been coming to CrossWalk for meetings. I had events here. I've hosted events here. I've helped with events here. I've always appreciated how giving CrossWalk is to our community and open to our community. But I never thought about going to church here. And then I've known you for a couple years through MLK, the MLK Coalition, where a bunch of spiritual leaders came together to serve on this one day, Martin Luther King Jr. You guys, I'm sure, have heard about it. And I just really appreciated the fact that these different leaders in town were putting aside their own views and coming together in connection over love and compassion and community and serving others. And then I really got to know Pete in January when we were put into this leadership cohort without really even knowing what it was. A bunch of us signed up to be part of this leadership cohort through First 5 Napa. And I heard him share about his experience in CrossWalk and how he was serving and how open and inclusive he wanted his church to be, and made some changes in order for it to be. And I was really inspired by that. And so I thought, I'm just going to go check it out. And I did, and I just kind of got hooked.
Awesome. Well, very cool.
And I'd been craving a spiritual community aside from my concept program. And so I found that, and I feel it every time I come here. So I really appreciate all of you, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know those of you that I don't know yet better.
Awesome. Good. That's good stuff. Very good. So is it okay if I pray for you before we close things out? And can I put my hand on your shoulder as the official prayer posture? All right. Very good. Will you pray with me? So God, wow, where to begin? Just so grateful for so many different things about Jeni. So grateful that somehow as a 15-year-old, her mind was changed. And God, I believe that you were involved in that process somehow for her to get help to see another day and many more days. And I thank you that she's always had a big heart, but when her heart was broken, not just by stuff in her own family, but people she didn't even know necessarily, that she actually did something about it. And I'm just so grateful that she had the sense of call to do something very different, that your spirit would be all over to bring hope and healing to kids in Napa, and by their influence far, far beyond. Thank you for what she's doing in her work today, and her leadership gift and her passion, and the blessing that Teens Connect has already been, and as it continues to grow, what it will be. And so, in a very personal kind of a way, I pray a double portion of your that she'll have more than she needs, more strength than she needs, clarity as she needs it, support financially with people, everything. That youth in our county will have hope, even though everything around them might be despair. So bless her and fill her and strengthen her and guide her as a good shepherd does. And we'll be grateful to cheerlead with her and beside her and behind her as we see great things happen through her. I ask all this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Jeni. Great stuff. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Hope you had a good experience.